So I have the wonderful Mel Broughton here to speak to us this evening. Mel has been involved in the animal rights movement for as long as time, I think, slightly less than Ronnie, but only just. He's been involved in the anti-vivisection movement. I know he started by sitting in a tent staring at ospreys. He was part of an attempt to rescue Rocky the dolphin, which didn't go as well as planned, but had an absolutely stunning outcome in the end. And he has been involved in, well, everything as far as I can put my mind to it. And I'll let him introduce himself beyond that because he'll be far better at it than I am. Good evening, Mel. Lovely to speak to you.
Yeah, good evening, and thank you very much for inviting me on tonight. It's a real pleasure to be able to talk to everyone. I suppose a brief potted history of my involvement in the animal rights movement. Like you said at the beginning, I suppose really, even as a child, I was particularly motivated about issues to do with justice and injustice, particularly. And growing up, I began to form strong views about not, the ill treatment of human beings and increasingly animals. And it was the very beginning. Well, probably my first ever demonstration was actually 1975, when I went to London for a Save the Whale demonstration with my mum and dad. Remember meeting Spike Milligan there and a few other people. I was 15 at the time, and roll forward a few more years, and I picked up a leaflet in Northampton town centre where I lived, an animal aid leaflet about vivisection. And I remember very, very well taking the leaflet off this lady who I still know to this day, still friends with, walking around the corner, reading it, turning it over, reading it again, and I walked straight back to this person and said, "When's the next meeting?" It was the thing I've been waiting for since I was a small child, the moment I've been waiting for, and just everything lit up for me. It was my life. And that was the start of it, really. So we're at the beginning of the 1980s, and the animal rights movement was on the move. I mean, you mentioned Ronnie earlier, who had already started to blaze a trail with the Animal Liberation Front and the actions that were undertaken by these amazing people to liberate animals and to damage the industries that abuse them. And I was always hugely impressed by that. Right from the word go, it just struck a real chord with me. And I started going to these meetings, and right from the very outset, I was started to look at people there and form opinions about, even this early stage, about who I thought might want to do something more than just going to demonstrations. And although I was doing all those things, and one of the first things I did with the anti-vivisection side of things was, I don't know if anyone remembers, there was a film by Richard Adams, who's the author of Watership Down, called Plague Dogs. And it was about two dogs that escaped from a laboratory in Cumbria. And they made a film of it, and it was shown in Northampton in the very early 1980s. And me and a few other people from the local animal aid group went down and did a kind of presentation outside the cinema, and also spoke to people who were going in about vivisection. And from there, I got involved in other demonstrations against boots and other things. But I was already well aware that, in my own mind, that I wanted to do more. And I met a couple of people at an animal aid meeting, and we talked about going hunt sabbing and doing something active. And so a few of us got together early on and started doing that. I took over the Northampton group because it was not functioning at the time, and we started going out. And it was my first introduction into direct action, so to speak. And throughout those early years, I just got progressively more and more involved. And at the same time, there were other things going on that were, and hopefully we'll talk about this later, because it's something that's coming up, and I know it's prevalent to what we're talking about tonight was World Day for Laboratory Animals, which was a big event. And I think and still believe one of the most important events in the animal rights calendar, and one that sadly is a poor reflection of what it used to be, which is a real shame, I think, because it was more than just a protest and a demonstration. It was a point at which the animal rights movement, the emerging animal rights movement, came together. Activists came together on this one day, and it always ended up in a small riot or a clash at the gates of a laboratory and people storming in. But it was a real kind of bellwether to a movement that was really burgeoning and really finding its feet. So an important day, and hopefully we can talk about that later. But I suppose inevitably, the deeper I got involved, and my kind of belief in the power of grassroots activism and also direct action led me to become involved in activities that were beyond the law. And it was a few years later that I was first arrested, and eventually I was convicted and sent to prison for the first time. But far from putting me off, it had exactly the opposite effect on me. It just galvanized more and more my belief that that campaigning for animal rights consists of a dual approach, and it's something I still very much believe now, that a successful movement, and you see this repeated throughout human rights struggles and other struggles, that you need a radical wing, and particularly with animal rights, you need a radical wing, and I believe you still do, in order to grab the attention and influence those that ultimately change laws or are responsible for what happens to animals in institutions like vivisection laboratories or the farming industry. And I think one of the things that the animal rights movement certainly did to a huge degree, certainly in the 1980s and through the 1990s and into the early 2000s, was create an atmosphere where people were listening to the animal rights argument because they didn't have any choice but to listen. And I think it's important to always realise that if it hadn't have been for that, I'm absolutely convinced we wouldn't have reached a point where animal rights would have entered the national consciousness and language as it did do. And also that the idea, animal rights is something that people, it's a term that people, I don't think really still probably now properly understand, but it is a political call, a change for the political states of animals, if you like, as well as a moral and ethical change of attitude. And I still am firmly of the belief that animal rights is the central argument and remains a central argument, even though the movement is a lot more diffuse now and seems to be heading in a dozen different directions at once, which I find a little bit depressing. But enough of that. I continue to, I came out of prison again in early 2000. That's when FEAT was first formed. And obviously we'll talk about it more later, when Cambridge University were looking to build what would have been the largest primate lab in Europe at Girton in Cambridge, and which was followed then by the campaign at Oxford, which ultimately led to my second and probably most serious, well, certainly most serious crossing swords with the law, and a long prison sentence that followed. Coming out from that, I was still very much motivated by the same things I always have been, and jumped, although I couldn't immediately jump back into movements, I was on strict license conditions. The moment those ran out, I returned immediately to Oxford to continue the campaign against that was now the completed Oxford Animal Lab. And rolling forward, I suppose, obviously I've missed lots out. There's a lot more that we can talk about, and a lot more that I was involved in, including the Animal Liberation Leagues in the 1980s, other campaigns against other animal abuse, many of those. But probably my most recent involvement was with the campaign at MBR, which was something I got involved in really after a discussion with a couple of other people about needing to reignite the movement and refocus some attention on the plight of laboratory animals. And we decided on MBR because it was dogs, beagles, because that would resonate with people. And we began what amounted to an 18-month surveillance operation on MBR, where we filmed almost covert filming took place almost every week for, say, almost 18 months, and then led to a expose in the Mirror newspaper and demonstrations, and then what became Camp Beagle. My personal involvement continued with the campaign and a further investigation into the operations of Impex, the laboratory couriers that were collecting beagles from MBR acres, but also are involved in moving laboratory animals around the UK and beyond, and also are couriers for primates imported into the UK and shipped to various contract testing laboratories around the country. This again resulted in my arrest in 2022 with two other people. Unfortunately for me, I was remanded. My co-defendants were given bail, but it seemed that because of my previous involvement in the Oxford campaign from 20 odd years before and the resulting prison sentence, it was deemed that I should be held in prison again. So I spent another 6 months up until the trial in 2023 in prison for 6 months, and then went to trial and was cleared of all charges. Myself and my co-defendant were cleared of all charges. And maybe we'll talk about this later, because it was an important trial for lots of reasons, and not least because we were charged particularly with harassment and stalking, and because of evidence that linked us to tracking devices that were found on 2 Impex vans, and also the campaign of demonstrations. And the worrying thing about it was, from our point of view, was that had we been convicted, it would have meant that anybody else wishing to carry out an investigation, a perfectly legitimate investigation against a vivisection company, could well have found themselves in the same position we were. Because at the end of the day, we did nothing more than monitor the movements and look for breaches of animal welfare law, as far as the beagles and other animals went in transportation. And at the same time conducted a campaign of demonstrations against Impex, the company involved. The trial was nearly 6 weeks long and was exhaustive, but the jury reached a unanimous verdict. It was unanimous. It took a very short time indeed to find us not guilty of all charges. So that was a huge relief, and I came out, and for the last since the trial ended, some 9 months ago now, or 8 or 9 months ago, I've kind of not exactly sat back, but been thinking about exactly where the future lies for me inside the animal rights movement. I've had a lot of questions that I've got to ask myself about how I feel about the movement now. I haven't changed my views or opinions at all about animal rights. I feel exactly the same as I did 40 years ago. Nothing's changed. What's changed is, and this is something we can probably touch on later, what's changed is the world we live in, and how the animal rights message is put out there now, and how we are effective. For me, as I say, I think some things haven't changed at all. Some things have, and not always for the best. But that's a brief potted issue. As I say, it is very brief, and I've left an awful lot out, but hopefully that gives us something to work from.
Thank you ever so much, Mel. For a potted history, that's quite in depth. I mean, obviously, and as we both know, you have left an awful lot out. So I'd like to, if we may, given that this campaign is focused around World Day for Animals in Laboratories, and we did touch on that earlier, can you explain to me where it came from, what it meant, and how it's transgressed or transformed through the years to where we are now, from
Yeah, I mean,
your perspective?
well, from my perspective, I mean, obviously, World Day for Laboratory Animals was in fact, United Nations designated day for laboratory animals. So it has a kind of, if you like, an official ring to it. But it's much more than that. And I'm going to cast my mind back to the first World Day for Laboratory Animals I ever went on, and it was in. We went from, I think it was South London. It was a march that went. It was a 10-mile march, and it went all the way to Coal Beaches, where at the time Beaver Laboratories were. And I remember there were thousands of people. I can't remember exactly how many, but thousands. And it was a hell of a long march. And we set off, and we had a break about halfway. And there's quite a funny story attached to it, which again is probably a sign of how things were developing then. And I remember we sat on a little common. Everyone sat down, thousands of people, and had a drink and that. And there was some guy sat behind me. I was sat with a few of my friends, Hunt Sabs, who had gone along. And there was 3 guys sat behind us looking a bit awkward. And we sat there, and all of a sudden, and I kid you not, we heard one of them say, "Sarge, would you like a drink?" and passed him a bottle of water. So even then, this movement was already attracting the attention of what were rather clumsy undercover coppers for the day, but sign of the times. But anyway, yeah, and eventually the march did get its way to Coleshaw. And what was always interesting about World Day, and why I have such fond memories, and why I believe it's more than the sum of its parts, is you had a heady mix of people there. There were Hunt Sabs, there were people who had been, I remember, who'd come back from doing stuff against the seal coal. There were people who were been involved in all kinds of basically grassroots direct action, but they all come together under the banner of World Day for Laboratory Animals. The issue of vivisection and animals in research was an absolute cornerstone of animal rights thinking, and I think for good reason, because it's a dangerous thing, I know, to quantify animal suffering, and I'm always cautious about doing it, because I know there are arguments about, well, the meat industry is more horrific because of the sheer number of animals involved. True, that is true, without a doubt. But there's something about the deliberate and calculated infliction of suffering, whether it be a mouse or a beagle or a monkey, over what can be considerable periods of time, suffering, deliberate, supposedly in the name of science, that really, really, I think, struck a chord with people who were previously animal welfareists, hunt saboteurs, whatever they were. There was something about this issue that spoke to them about the need for animal rights, and also for that domination or of human beings over animals, that I don't think you can quite see anywhere else. And that's not, as I say, you have to be careful about these kind of things. That's not to diminish the suffering that farm animals go through. It's horrendous, it's horrific. But I think for the movement, vivisection really spoke out because of that. And I think it's true to say that it's not, if you look back historically, you go back another 100 years before that, and it was also true. Those very early pioneers that we now credit with probably being the grandmothers and grandfathers of animal rights were very much involved in campaigning against vivisection. You read about the brown dog affair and the riots in London over the brown dog. There were major riots about this statue that the medical students attacked. Major riots. So it clearly was an issue that touched those early, would have been just, vegetarians and, you know, nascent animal welfare campaigners who saw this issue as a really important one for the growing concern for animals and what would become the animal rights movement. But back to World Day, and I think World Day, as you went along these marches, and they were often quite long, the early ones, I remember, the mood built as you went along. You were talking to other people you've been sabbing with. You were talking to other people who'd come back to say from a circle or something, or done this and done that. And you could see people were in little groups, and you know those little groups of people had probably been out a couple of nights before rescuing animals or up to something else. It was, everyone knew it, and they were dressed in their khaki army surplus jackets. It was an army, if you like, on the move. And there was a real buzz about it. And that energy built through the march. And I remember at the Cole Short one in particular, by the time we got to the lab, there was a lot of police there. And they knew what was going to happen. I think because the pitch had reached such, by the time we got there, forget the speeches and that everyone stands politely for now and claps for. No one was interested. All people wanted to do was get in that laboratory and get those animals out. And they would and I remember getting battered by officers with truncheons and that, and would throw themselves at the fences and try and get over. And you could say, oh, well, what a foolhardy thing to do. But I disagree. I disagree because what you felt was not just a camaraderie, but a real commonality of anger and purpose to do something. I find that I don't find that there so much now. And people say, oh, well, it's a different time, Mel. It's a different. Yeah, but it is a different time, and there are socially different mores and communication devices around, and people are on social media. But I don't think you can replace what is inside people's gut about something, and that's what happened at World Day. And I think the other overarching importance about World Day was people looked forward. People really wanted to be there because it was a part of the movement that they invested everything in. And again, it goes back to that almost culture of organise yourself. I remember the Porton Down World Day when where a whole train was hired to take people. Thousands of people turning up. Again, people trying to storm Porton Down. People getting onto the railway line and stopping an express train. And you could say again, oh, well, what's that achieve? It's foolhardy, but you're missing the point. You're missing a point here. If you were there, you went away from them so energized that the weeks and months that followed those things were alive with action. We're alive with people who'd gone away and thought, right, I'm going to do more. So they weren't just, it was a day that invested in people a desire and a willingness to do more. And I suppose it reached its climax and probably where the downward spiral began, and it was probably linked to the downward spiral of organisations like the BUAV and NAVS, who was in 93, I think, when 23,000 people were in London for World Day. But it was the high point at which things began to fall in terms of World Day. And I found it one of the saddest things for me with that's happened during my whole time in the animal rights movement. Happened in I think it is after I'd come out of prison the second time, and I was just coming off license, and I went to my first World Day, which I hadn't been allowed to go to for 10 years, in Birmingham. And I got there, and I couldn't believe it. There was less than 200 people there, shuffled in this little park, and it was just an absolute shadow of a movement as far as I was concerned. And I'm going to, one of the things I also remember about that day and was that there was a vegan festival going on in Birmingham the same day, and apparently, so I was informed, there were thousands of people queuing up to go in. Now, I don't know whether you want to go through this argument again about the animal rights movement and the vegan movement. I've got my views and other people have got theirs, but I think I do question, and I continue to question, the vegan festivals and that kind of thing does not generate the kind of intensity of feeling and sense of part of a vibrant movement that World Day for Laboratory Animals did, and did for a number of years. I know times change and everything, but I still feel that something's been lost. Something significant's been lost.
From your point of view, I mean, you say it was that massive difference, sort of somewhere in the late 90s. Would that be?
Yeah, yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on what killed it?
I think there's no doubt, and and I have to take my fair share of responsibility for possibly what has happened. I mean, after all, I was part of a campaign that was set up to stop the building of the Oxford Animal Lab, and there was a lot of action that was controversial connected to it, and I ended up myself going to prison for a long time. And also there were the Shack campaign and the Save the New Church Guinea Pigs campaign. And there was this period where there was a high intensity of activity and there were successes coming one after the other. And then the inevitable happened, and something that was always going to happen anyway, is that the powers that be decided they were going to put a stop to him, particularly Tony Blair and Lord Sainsbury, who were significant players in what happened to our movement. There's no doubt about that. And you could look at the history of particularly Lord Sainsbury with his involvement with Cambridge University when the primate lab was being mooted. His donation to New Labour and his post as science minister. There was a political move and a legal move to crush us, and it was put into action with clinical and targeted effect, where a group of people were just taken out of it, put on trial very publicly, and sentenced to long sentences, and very strict licensing conditions when they came out. And I found myself in high security prisons for a lot of that time, in very, very draconian conditions. So the political message was clear that the animal rights movement had to be stopped, and particularly the anti-vivisection movement and its grassroots direct action arm. And it's often been said, and it's still said now, that, and you still hear it now, that had a very, very chilling effect on the whole movement. It undoubtedly did have an effect on the movement, and we're still living with that now.
Do you think it was a fear of? You think it was a fear of long-term incarceration?
That's certainly one factor, yeah. But I think what I find troubling about it is that it was always clear, and anyone who's I find some people sometimes a bit politically naive. If you do any reading at all about social movements of any kind, of all hues and persuasions, they all at some point hit repressive action or counter action by those they're trying to influence or change. It's inevitable. It was inevitable for our movement as well. I'm still shocked that our movement recoiled so much from it and didn't seem at all aware that it was bound to happen, and we should have been more prepared for that. I still struggle with that now. Why are people surprised by it? It was inevitable. I mean, if you look at the kind of particularly the speech that Tony Blair gave in Parliament, where he openly talked about not allowing a movement, and he meant the animal rights movement, to dictate what happens to business in the UK. And it was clear, it's clear to everyone. But the idea that was never going to come or wouldn't come is ridiculous. Of course it was going to come. As sure as a crackdown on any movement that's been successful will come. The test of the movement is how you respond to it. And how you move forward. And I'm a long way convinced that our movement has responded correctly. In fact, in many ways, I think it hasn't. I think one of the other things that I felt really sad about with that particular period, it happened particularly with the campaign in Oxford, was that through we created a lot of controversial headlines to some of the campaign tactics, and the media got massively interested in because it was Oxford, I think, and because it was this bastion of the establishment and a university of world renown, that because it was being attacked by these upstarts who were talking about monkeys, rats, and other animals and trying to stop the building of this biomedical research facility, that we became this public enemy. But out of that came this huge amount of press interest. I mean, it was massive. I mean, we were never far, there was a continuous roller coaster in media interest. And one of the things we tried to do at the time, and it's something that was never capitalized on, was that we tried to engage scientists in taking up these debates, to speak up and make the scientific case for animal rights, for ending experimenting on animals. And the platform had been created for that. But so many times we were let down by the people who were supposed to be preparing for that argument. And more often than not, we'd have to do it ourselves. Now, not being scientifically trained, with the best will in the world, and I went on quite a lot of programs with Radio 4, with their science editor, and various other debates and that. Though I learned as much as I could, and I always have done, I still I wasn't Dr. Mel of So-and-so Institute. I was Mel Broughton, the animal rights extremist. And it always meant that we started these debates from behind the starting line. And it was an opportunity that was missed by our movement. And it's what I was saying before about the two sides of the movement. The grassroots activists and the campaigns, such as Shack or Speak or whatever, were creating the necessary atmosphere for things to happen. And particularly with Shack, who were on the verge of actually winning with their battle against HLS. I think there was a massive letdown from the other side in not capitalising on that. Now, I know I do read stuff now about people involved in research, and you have started, who do talk about non-animal research, and more power to them. But it's not strident enough. And also, we don't have, I personally feel we don't have that grassroots anger about this that we had before to keep driving it. As I said before, for me, it's a very diffuse movement now that seems to marshal lots of other arguments that I don't know particularly helpful or are relevant, particularly informative of animal rights, and why animal rights is such a. I mean, let's be absolutely clear about this. Animal rights is fundamental to life on Earth, as all political movements and social changes happen with the evolution of human thinking and understanding. It strikes me as crazy that at a time when the understanding about what animals are capable of thinking and feeling, and I read so much about this, that in actual fact it's harder now to get the animal rights message across, because I think it's been left behind for other arguments that people have either felt are more easy to proffer or are less risky. I'm afraid there's no gain in this world without taking risk. There just isn't. And I think for the animal rights movement, that's even more true. That because we're talking on behalf of other species who are different from us in some ways, but so similar in others, it's doubly important that we don't lose sight of the fact that this is an argument about rights. It's not just a lifestyle thing. In fact, to me, that's a secondary consideration. It's more fundamental than that. It's absolutely fundamental to, if you like, to human evolution. Without us recognising and actually acting on animal rights, we're failing. We are failing, and I think it brings us I suppose, right up to where we are to now, in the sense that this is my last real, I suppose, my last real push was with starting the MBR, was getting involved at the beginning of MBR. And I have to say, you know, I don't want to get into arguments about, particularly about people or personalities. I'm just not interested. But I am disappointed. You know, I think it's good to be honest about these things. You know, I'd like to come on here and be all hopeful about everything, and more often than not, you know, that's the message I give across. But I also want to be honest about things as well. Say that I think we are failing on some levels, and I think there needs to be, particularly from the grassroots movement, a bit of a soul search about something I think we've lost. We need to retain.
Just to sorry, just to step back very, very slightly. You were talking about the animal rights movement and the fact that it is a rights movement. Just to clarify, when you talk about rights, you're talking about the moral intrinsic rights, not legal frameworks.
Both. I'm talking about both, really, because one follows from the other. I'm talking about both. Yeah. I mean, I listen to, you know, and read conversations about, because you've got all these interchangeable words now in the movement, you know, animal liberation, veganism, plant-based, so on and so forth. But they're all kind of, to me, just offshoots. The vegan thing's one that is interesting, because I mean, I've been a vegan for over 40 years, and I understand the moral reasons why, if you're an animal rights person, logically you should be vegan. But I do not accept that veganism is animal rights. I really don't. It simply isn't. It is a diet that is completely consistent, contingent with being an animal rights activist. But if you're talking about getting a message across to society and to people who are in positions where decisions are made about the future of animals and their status, the rights argument has to be paramount. And also, it's the voice that should be heard from our movement, because the movement otherwise becomes not a movement, but a collection of different strands of a movement. And that's always going to be difficult to marshal that into I think, a truly effective fighting force for animals. And the one thing I think that I always treasure about those early days is that common understanding of purpose, particularly amongst the grassroots activists and those who were probably more direct action minded, was very focused, very clear. I mean, all right, people had differences. Human beings will always do that. But I think that the great thing was that those differences were often, more than not, sorted out quite quickly between people. And then it was back on, back to the, you know, the fight for animal rights, and always thinking about how best to progress the movements. I think one of the other important things that people should always ask themselves when they're doing their campaigning or whatever is the question I always ask myself about something is, does this action or does this campaign further the cause of animal rights? If you believe the answer to that is yes, then it's the right path to choose. But you need to ask yourself that, because it can't just be the case that people do things just because it feels that they've done something, or just because it feels that they can write something on social media about it. It doesn't follow that that's necessarily going to be of any benefit to the movement as a whole, or to progress the cause of animal rights. And it's another issue I feel quite strongly about, is that we need to be a bit more thoughtful about that. I mean, obviously I can hear people shouting already down, oh, well, you know, more people are vegan now. But yeah, they are. And great, you know, but
not animal rights, though.
It's not enough. And it's certainly not enough to, I don't think, convince those who need convincing that things must change. I think in many ways, and I think that was also true for me, particularly during the 80s and 90s, that because of the grassroots activists and because of the activism and because of the kind of attention it was grabbing, the public was already moving ahead of thinking in government and elsewhere else to grasping the idea of animal rights. But that, as I said before, for the reasons that I've outlined, that I believe was lost around that period in the 2000s. And the response since then has been too diffuse for our movement, for people, for the public to really understand anymore. I wonder now, if you ask the average person in the street what animal rights was or what it meant, they'd probably struggle to give you a clear answer. And I think
probably think it meant buying a vegan burger.
They might well do, yeah. And again, I'm going to get shouted down by the vegans, but I don't actually care about that because, as I say, I quite reached an accommodation with veganism that it's important that for consistency as an animal rights activist, you adopt a vegan diet. But if you're going to say that to the exclusivity of ruling people out of the movement straight away, then how do you expect animal rights to become a movement? I mean, and remember, I went through a similar experience myself at the beginning. I was a vegetarian when I was going hunt sabbing right at the very beginning of the 1980s. I wasn't a vegan. And I met my first vegan in a police cell in Cambridge after an anti-vivisection demo at Abraham. I still remember him. Ian Gatenby, his name was, from Newcastle. And we got arrested after jumping up, storming the fence and ripping it down at Abraham. And quite a few of us got nicked and ended up in court. And I had into cells with him and got talking, and he was a vegan and I was veggie, and I got talking to him and I came out and I was vegan. But to me, that was because I had a conversation with another animal rights person. We talked about animal rights philosophy and what the animal rights movement was. And the veganism was this is the logical thing to do. But in terms of using it as the standard, if you like, the standard bearer for the movement, doesn't make sense to me. I don't know, I just find it difficult now to find a real place I feel comfortable anymore. But yeah.
So let's move away from there then. Take you back to a nice, safe, comfortable space. Obviously, you've had an awful lot of work within the anti-vivisection movement, and like yourself, I feel that it very much is the cornerstone. And you don't have to be vegan to get in on it. It's a very great gateway into the animal rights movement. So, with all of your experience through campaigning and stuff, what would you say are the highs and the lows? What were the bits that you felt really made a difference, and the bits that you felt were pissing in the wind, for want of a better expression?
Oh, it's not difficult for me to answer that one. I think the high moments were definitely reading about and maybe sometimes being involved in the liberation of the laboratory animals that were going on. Always a huge lift. And other actions where direct action was taken against establishments, and also I think another big thing, I think an important period for the development of animal rights, and particularly with the anti-vivisection movement, was the animal liberation leagues, who I think made an enormous difference, and with the philosophy that they adopted and took, which was large-scale raids, daylight raids on significant animal research targets. I mean, the Northern Animal Liberation League being the first of those, and their sort of raid on Abraham Institute, which got headline-grabbing news. But also another little story about that, which I think is really, again, instructive about how impactful grassroots activism is, and direct action particularly, again, was to do with Northern Animal Liberation League. That was a daylight raid on the holding station for, I think it was Manchester University, where some dogs were taken by some people who went in during the day, and one of them was a black Labrador, who turned out was a stolen pet. And now this black Labrador appeared on the front of one of the national newspapers, and he answered to the name Blackie, and the family who had that dog taken from them came forward to reclaim him. So there's a national story in the UK, this animal loving nation, of a university that was using stolen dogs off the street. This is in the 1980s in the UK, being reunited with its rightful owners after being rescued by a bunch of unruly, long-haired animal rights activists. And things like that just really jumped out at me. I just was so impressed and so utterly beguiled by it, and the effect it could have, the effect it was having. And there was also another one, which I remember very well, which I think was on the front page of the Daily Mirror, and it was a raid by some people on Laundry Farm, which was the holding station for Cambridge University in the 1980s, where this is where animals were kept that were being vivisected on in the university. And I think it was about 11 dogs were taken, which included beagles and lots of crossbreeds. And the Mirror, I think it was pretty sure it was the Daily Mirror, their front page was 11 passport-sized pictures of these dogs, and the headline was "Rescued by the ALF." Not extremist steel dogs like you get, none of that. Rescued by the ALF. In other words, an absolute approval of an action by animal rights activists. And I suppose, we were talking about the animal liberation leagues and the kind of positive effect they had. I think another particular one that stood out for me was the Central Animal Liberation League, who carried out a raid on a Sunday afternoon in the middle of August on Park Farm, which was the holding station for Oxford University. And this place held beagles, crossbreed dogs, monkeys that had a primate house, rabbits, guinea pigs, lots of other animals, all destined to be used in the University of Oxford. And again, a group of people under the banner of the Central Animal Liberation League. It's a Sunday afternoon, no nighttime stuff here. This is a summer Sunday afternoon. And people went in onto the site without being detected and rescued dogs and other animals. But one of the beauties about it was, and there's a couple of stories here, was that they actually stole the university's own van parts on the site, put the animals in the back of it and drove it away. So, it's a combination of just sheer audacity along with a high level of intelligence. And the following morning, it was headlines on what was then TVAM. I don't even remember Anne Diamond interviewing spokesperson. And it was headlines, and people were the nation was getting up for its breakfast and seeing images of beagles and an old English sheepdog, another dog that had probably come off the streets of Oxford or somewhere in the Midlands, being taken out by people with masks on, and a very positive attitude about it. And I think they achieved something really special and something really, really lasting that had a significant impact on the whole movement and helped to propel it forward. So the Animal Liberation Leagues are very, very important, and combining that grassroots activism and direct action with savvy media use, but very, very effective. Yeah.
And what about from the legal aspects of it and the judiciary and the government and things? How do you feel? What's the way to push that envelope to make those people move, so to speak?
I'm of a very clear opinion, and again, it comes from reading extensively on other social movements. Unless you put pressure, and the kind of pressure that can't be ignored, then they won't listen. There's no reason for them to. What reason have they got to listen? And I mean, I think, MBR is an interesting one, because I remember at the beginning of MBR, when we did the first demonstration at the Home Office, and we had a statement shortly after. It had been in the Daily Mirror, pictures of dogs being taken around the site on crates, all the rest of it. And Priti Patel making a statement about, this is awful, this must come to an end. And we've all heard that before. And it's a typical comment, I suppose, from a sitting, or in this case, a Home Office minister, that they make these statements, probably with no intention of ever really doing anything about it, or probably even believing it in the first instance. So that's informative about the way you treat this. But the way to treat it is not to believe it. The way to treat it is as almost a lie and push even harder. But I don't think that any politician, unless they're already sympathetic, and I don't know, a few are, will really move until they know that the intent on those of us who are campaigning is serious enough. And that's not a threatening thing in that sense, but it is a reality check that governments have taken a long, often decades to consider human rights abuses in the past. They kept letting them roll on until the pressure from those on the ground, the grassroots activists, made them act. The public will always come along eventually. They always do. But I think, again, there's sometimes too much of a feeling that we have to have public blessing all the time. We don't. We really don't. What we have to do is be bold and confident in the calls that we're making on behalf of animals. And I think underneath, on some very basic levels, enough of the population are understanding. There are some who will never care, but they will never care about anything, but we can't worry about that. But I think it's incumbent on the movement itself. It is our responsibility. We started this. If we didn't want to see it through, we should never have started it. And we should have the courage of the conviction that sets on this path for animal rights to continue it to our most effective level possible.
I'm just, excuse me. I'm going to interject and just remind people we've got Mel for a bit longer. And so if there are questions that you have that you want to put to him, you need to put those in the chat. And once they've been put in the chat, Imi will pick them up and ask those of Mel. I think probably the last thing I'm going to ask you, Mel, is how fundamental do you think outreach is? Obviously, you've talked about, the need for pressure campaigning and other things, but you also talked about wanting to get the public on board, and obviously we know we're not going to get all of them. But I feel like, for me, part of the grassroots movement is doing that outreach, and it is that speaking to the public directly.
How does
that work for you?
I have a kind of mixed feeling about it. Having done a lot of it myself in the past, I mean, I've spent too many hours on the street, doing it. You call it outreach. Outreach is not a word I really like very much, but doing stores or whatever. And, throughout the 80s, 90s, I was always out doing that kind of thing. And I could see a value to it, but the value only comes if the public are already in their minds being, if you like, corralled or pushed towards the animal rights position. And that, I think, doesn't come from the outreach. That comes from the activists on the ground. That comes from the grassroots activists themselves, if you like, doing the actions. I think that's where the jolts, if you like, come from. The outreach follows that in the sense that there's always a need to explain why animal rights is important, why people should take it seriously. But I think there's a tendency now to overemphasize the outreach part of it. I'm not saying it shouldn't be done. And as I say, I've done an awful lot of it myself. But I think, the media also, one of the things that I always remember as being quite, I touched on this earlier about being involved. I did a lot of media stuff, not because I wanted to during the Oxford campaign, because no one else would get up there and do it. So I took it by the scruff of the neck and did it. And I didn't want to do it, but I looked around me and thought, and I made myself as effective as I could at it. But it always bothered me that, and I'd heard other people go on and comment on animal rights things, and sometimes it was very depressing because they clearly hadn't researched what they were talking about, or had made a poor job of it. And that does matter, because I still believe that even in the social media age, if you get 2 or 3 minutes on the BBC or wherever, that's still a massive thing, because it got people's front rooms. I don't care how pervasive social media is. There's something about getting those live 2 or 3 minutes, or whatever, on a especially a mainstream TV channel that really grabbed the attention. And I remember one example particularly strongly, and it was the South East Animal Liberation League, who had carried out a daylight action against the Royal College of Surgeons in Kent, and they'd gone in on a Sunday again. 150, 200 people during the day had got in and had filmed dogs in there. But one of the things that happened during that particular action was that documents were removed and some photographs removed, and it showed a picture of a monkey, and the monkey had crap tattooed on its head. I remember very well on that Sunday at home at 9 o'clock in the evening, the ITN news came on and the headline flashed up, the first news item, and across the screen splashed this picture of the monkey. And the impact was huge. There was outrage. There was a court case that came out of it. There was a conviction in the Royal College of Surgeons, which later they got overturned. But for the first time in history, a animal research organisation got put in the dock because of the combined actions of the activists and the use of its political or its media wing working properly together to get a result. I don't think I've ever seen a better example of what happened of that. But I think I'm getting away from outreach. So the outreach thing,
I think media and outreach are part of the same thing, aren't they? Really,
they are. I mean, it depends how you do outreach as well. It depends how you present it. As I said, I've done many street stalls with my placards and my leaflets, but I've also, we also used to try and do other things. Like I remember one particular one we did during the Oxford campaign was we had the outreach thing set up in Oxford Centre, but then to grab attention, there was a church tower in the centre. So we set up the outreach below the church tower, and then 2 people paid to go up into the top of the church tower with a 20-foot long banner. And while the outreach was going on, the banner was thrown over the top. So I think there's outreach and there's outreach. I think sometimes the more you court controversy, the better, I think, even if it means, and we had some of the ones we did in Oxford were really heated, but they were good. A lot of people would stop to get involved. I'm very much in favour of actually controversy and causing controversy. I think it's important. I think you have to do that. If you're not prepared to do that, then it's not going to work.
I've got a couple of questions in the chat for you, Mel. So I've got a comment and a question from Deb. So from Wales Against Animal Experiments, first of all, they say great talk. And then I think I may know the answer to this question, but are you optimistic about the government's pledge to phase out animal testing?
In the short to medium term, no. Absolutely not. But as I said before, I think these things are contingent on the movement. I think you can speed things up as long as we're creative and adopt the right attitude towards putting the pressure on. And that, I think that's always been the case. I don't, as I said before, many things in life do change, but some things don't. And I think there are some basic things that remain true now as they did in 1980. And certainly in the attitude we take towards the campaigns we conduct. And maybe we should, social media is obviously something that I my early involvement didn't involve. It didn't exist, so it was never an issue. But I do think that one factor that's problematic for us is these circular arguments that happen on social media, and that you see them all the time. They're going nowhere. They just sort of descend into bickering and then personal attacks on people, and they just become exhausting. But they're kind of like they just sap the life out of the movement, and they also sap the life out of the energy that's required to conduct hard hitting and focused campaign. So I've got a simple message about this. If you're involved in some online debate or social media debate about whether it's vivisection or whatever it is, and you see it going that way, drop out of it. There's no need to perpetuate it. It doesn't do our movement any good at all. There seems to be this desire that you've got to have the last word. No, you haven't. Just leave it.
Yeah.
And let the sensible and the right arguments rise to the top, which they will do. Don't perpetuate the ones that, and let's all be honest, there are some people out there who, quite honestly, I wish they'd fuck off out of the movement. I really, because they just seem to want to argue, right, for the sake of it. Well, you're not doing anything other than making sure that the goal we're trying to achieve gets further and further away. How dare you do that? What gives you the right to do that? You don't have the right to do that. If you're part of a movement like the animal rights movement, your responsibility is to advance that movement towards its goal. And if that includes knowing when to keep your trap shut, then keep your trap shut when you need to keep it shut. You don't always need to comment. Sometimes you're wrong and other people are right. I'm not always right, I'm wrong. And hopefully I'll always be big enough to accept that and shut my own trap. As a responsible and member of a movement that we all believe in. So hopefully nobody's taking offence. If they have, tough.
So a question from Louise. What do you think the future of MBR is going to be if it carries on as it is, as the campaign Camp Beagle? Do you see it ending anytime soon?
Honest answer, no, I don't see it ending anytime soon at all. Again, at the risk of getting involved in the kind of arguments that have already circulated around Camp Beagle and the whole MBR campaign, I hope, this is what I hope, that World Day at MBR is attended by as many grassroots animal rights activists as possible, because at the end of the day, MBR is, I think, a vitally important campaign to win, because it's been a running sore for the movement for a long time. There have been, 2 previous campaigns that ended in failure, and this time I personally really thought that this would be it, but I think there has been a fractioning of the kind of activism around MBR, and the camp alone can't succeed in closing MBR. It has to be the efforts of the whole movement with all its tools to do it. But again, without wanting to get involved in loads of arguments that have gone before, I think it's become a one facet show, and that's not good enough. Certainly, I think a lot of people have been put off from going, which is a real shame, as the start of the campaign was so energetic. And some of the, I suppose, some of the social media output and arguments around the various factions have been utterly disgraceful, and personally left me feeling utterly depressed by the state of the animal rights movement. But, and I want to be positive about this, it's not the end. There is every reason and every possible chance to to do it, you know. And it's not about saying that Camp Beagle haven't got a role to play, or it's not a point about saying that they can't be there. The point is, it's the rest of the movement that needs to engage down there and needs to feel that they can engage down there without being criticised by whatever action they decide to take. Because at the end of the day, the thing that MBR can't be allowed to do is get comfortable with a one facet or one element campaign where they feel they know it, they feel comfortable with it, and they don't feel enough pressure from it. That can't be right. That can't be right, you know. And I feel personally a lot of sadness about it, and I don't mind admitting that I found it depressing in the end, really depressing. And you know, and I've had some quite unpleasant arguments with people over it, and in fact have been you know, vilified by a few people simply for even making comments about Camp Beagle or you know, the direction that the campaign's taken. And I'm not saying ever that they haven't got a role, but what I'm saying very clearly is that the campaign to close MBR can and will be won if the whole grassroots animal rights movement gets involved and doesn't feel like it can't be there or it can't act. You know, if you look at the success, as short-lived as it was, against Impex, you know, by when they were singled out and put under pressure and their secret base was found, you know, they were for a time shut down. They were paralysed. You know, it shows what could be done. But I think there's a level of self-preservation about what's happening at MBR now, that this one element has to survive at whatever cost, and that can't be right. What has to happen is the closure of MBR, even if that means that sometimes you sacrifice some elements of a campaign for others. You can't be driven by the preservation of one element of a campaign. The only thing that can drive the campaign is the victory. And if that, you know, sometimes that means making not so popular choices about how you campaign, but that's got to be the right thing, surely. You know, I've got no doubt that somebody's going to be straight onto it and saying, "No, bad mouthing this and bad mouthing that," but I'm not. I just see it as an honest appraisal of what's, you know, of what's happened, and I feel I have a right to do that, because at the start of this, I invested a lot of time in my life into trying to create something that would ignite the grassroots animal rights movement again, along with a couple of other people. We worked hard to bring that about, to try and bring that about, and also, you know, with what was an extremely difficult court case to try and you know, defend the right for people to investigate and carry out a campaign, and I feel that the strength of the grassroots animal rights movement always was its ability to recognise what was effective and to do it, and not to be constrained by one element or another. And I feel that I don't care now. Actually, I don't care. I think one element has paralysed it. I think it has, and I don't think that's right. I'm sorry, but it's not right. This is a movement, not for animal rights. This is a movement, and in this case, a campaign to shut down this dog breeding facility. That surely, you know, if you look at it on its own, it stands as a totem almost, that if it's removed, it gives you a stepping stone. I mean, some people saying, well, you should be campaigning for the end of all animal experiments. Of course you want all our experiments to end, but let's be realistic. You know, you sometimes need, or presented with an opportunity to open a door, a significant door, and MBR is that door. it is that door that does give you the opportunity to have a much bigger impact on the wider vivisection industry, and that needs to be recognised. So, you know, we had this similar thing with the Oxford campaign. It was very difficult taking on Oxford University to make any dents against an institution that powerful. But one of the things we learned was, and one of the things that was most successful for us, was when we did a campaign against about one monkey called Felix, which really caught the imagination because people identified with him. He was a real animal, you know. And the tragedy about that was, and I suppose the lesson was, is that he was a part of a 5-year study into brain research, 5-year study into brain function. And the university, when we organised a national demonstration just for Felix, and we had a big build up to it, and the university knew that, and he was having an effect. And do you know what they did? And I got told by a police officer from Thames Valley Police, who contacted me a few days before the National March, said, "Mel, I have to let you know the university have killed him." They killed Felix rather than let us have a victory, rather than let him become a totem for a whole campaign against that lab. They actually killed it before the experiment, the 5-year project license. He was only in the first year of it, if I remember right, and they killed him, got rid of him. And I think with MBR, I just feel that it's like, in a way, it's something that is like a key to unlocking a very important door. And I fear that if what I think might happen does happen, it won't just be a tragedy for those dogs, it'll be a tragedy for our movement. Because I'm not sure how a movement that started off so positively about closing that place down, if it ends up in a position where it just fizzles out because of the domination by one element, then that's not going to be a positive thing for any of us. And I don't say that as an attack on any individual. I say that as a part of the movement. And I'm prepared, you know, I'm damned if I'll be quiet about that. I do see it as a setback for us all. And particularly you, Louise, who put so much into it, have sacrificed so much, you know, with your, you know, amazing stuff along with young Alan there, as being real examples of doing exactly what was needed. You thought outside the box. You did something that everybody else should be doing. You know, I can only congratulate you and say, you know, how admired you are by so many of us for doing what you did. It's exactly what was needed. It's exactly what was needed. I just wish more people had taken the message that you so bravely and publicly sent out there. It deserves to be listened to. You shone a light in what I believe was becoming not something that the movement should be massively proud about. I think you were a breath of fresh air and a return to what is best about our movement. So, you know, I thank you for that. And from someone who hasn't been down there for a while, you know, I could find myself often feeling so awful about it. But I can't lie and pretend that I'm not disappointed. I am tremendously disappointed by what I consider to be an unnecessary domination of an issue that should have been wholly owned and by the whole movement, and the whole movement should have been allowed to feel more like it was able to operate around MBR without being judged by other people. And that's
There's a bit of a follow-on question here, which is I've been following the Marty project in America regarding Rigland Farms. How can we get people involved in something like this for the UK?
I think
I don't know that project myself, but I think the question is
No.
how do we reinvigorate? How do we re-inspire people?
I think again I'm going to go back to basics. The things that inspired me were the actions of people. I think you inspire a movement by setting examples. I think people will always look for some people to maybe lead the way, or set an example about what can be achieved, and then become empowered by that. Like I was just talking about with yourself and Louise, which is what you did. It's sad that it hasn't been taken up more, but I think that does exist in people still out there. I think there is a lot of frustration, particularly about MBR, and I can really understand why they are. I really can. And I think it is to do with example. I really do. It goes back to what I suppose we talked about at the start of this, about the movement that I and yourself and Louise and others came into. That I was always very inspired by the people around me. I always was. Ronnie, people like that, and had a huge impact on me. But I think they had a huge impact on me because the kind of actions that I was seeing going on around me made me feel that I was part of a movement that was supportive, that was always thinking, and had a very can-do attitude. This can-do attitude, the way the campaigns were organised was very much people doing it themselves, organising themselves, creating their own banners if it was a banner drop, organising their own protests and making them different every time. I think we've fallen into a bit of a malaise, even about protesting, and I know that well from the end of the kind of Oxford stuff we're doing, where we were in the end just reduced to standing outside the lab because of the injunction and that, but that's still not a good enough excuse to just stand there holding placards every week. And even I knew, and I carried it on for a while because I was desperate to carry it on, but even I knew it was uninspiring, utterly uninspiring. How could you can't inspire a generation of people to get active by just doing that. It's not going to work. You've got to feel that the movement you're involved in, the campaign you're involved in, is always looking ahead, is always looking for another opportunity, and a way to, if you like, raise the stakes. And I suppose it goes back, to what I've been saying throughout this. And after, from my own personal journey in the movement, the things that inspired me 40 odd years ago still inspire me now. I mean, nothing's changed on that level. I mean, I find myself often rereading or re-looking at stuff because I suffer from not getting inspired by a lot of some of the stuff I see going on now. Particularly the unnecessary and pointless merry-go-round of recriminations that social media seems to be used for. Social media isn't activism in itself. It's just the means of encouraging people to be active. But at the end of the day, it's a physical action by people themselves that get interpreted, whether it's on social media or whatever it is, and that inspires others. It's not the likes or the thumbs up or the emojis. It's the actual actions themselves that will inspire others. And I suppose, we saw that with the Animal Rising liberation of the dogs from MBR, which was I was in Peterborough prison at that point, waiting trial for the Impex thing, and I remember someone coming in to see me and telling me about it, and I'd been feeling in the dumps, but I was so elated in the visiting room when I heard about it. I was so overjoyed. It was like being on cloud nine. And I think that it's almost childlike. It is almost childlike, but I suspect that looking at you out there, you feel exactly the same. I've got no doubt you'd be excited in the same way that I was and am by those things, because it speaks to us as activists, it speaks to us as animal rights campaigners, it speaks to us on that very, very personal level, about why we got involved, you know, and why we're still involved. I don't think if we'd have come in and just, I don't know, spent our whole lives just doing outreach, or our whole lives just doing marches, that it would be something, it'd be difficult to maintain. It's those moments of brilliant, brave action that really do count. If you like, as I always say, that's the petrol you put in the engine of the movement. The movement's the engine, but the petrol is those moments that really, really spark it into life, make it relevant. And it's become more controversial now because of the kind of times we live in, and the kind of general anti-protest and activism vibe that's out there in government and that. But I would again say that that's just inevitable. You know, the people we fight against are powerful. Their resources are enormous, and you know, they have considerable power. But what they don't have is what we always have, and that's the ability to think outside the box and the drive to achieve what we know is right, and that's a world where animal rights exists and where animals are no longer treated as test subjects or you know, fodder for the farming industry or whatever it might be. That's the thing that will always keep us going. But I would appeal to everyone, particularly now as we approach World Day for Laboratory Animals, and maybe it's incumbent on some of us older ones more than ever to speak up about why it matters so much to our movement, because it does. We wouldn't be where we are without it. We wouldn't be the animal rights movement if it wasn't for that. The World Day for Laboratory Animals, it's not just a demonstration, it's a statement of intent, it's a state of mind, it's a clarion call every year to fight on. And I wish it was reflected in the kind of World Day we had, but maybe this year MBR provide that for us. I certainly hope so.
On that note, we've got a message from Camp Beagle. It says, we hope to see you all on the 26th at MBR and on the 28th in London, or in fact any day of the whole calendar. There's a protest here every day against the workers, and every single time Impex vans come to collect puppies. I've got one more question for you, Mel, although that last bit sounded like the perfect way to end. I have got one more question. Do you think there's too much money to lose on the politicians' side for animal experiments to end? That comes from Jackie.
Yeah, that's a popular argument, and it's a popular kind of statement, isn't it? There's too much money involved. I don't believe that. There was too much money involved in HLS, but look how close they came to crumbling. I mean, the thing is, you can always argue that they're too big, but then if you take that attitude, then pack up and go home, because there's no point in carrying on. You know, I don't take that attitude. I don't think it doesn't matter how much money you've got. You can be the richest person in the world, but when an idea or an ideal time has come, no amount of money is going to stop it from happening. And that's where we win and they lose, because we have something more powerful than any amount of money. And that is knowing that A, we're right, and that animal rights is something that for decades now, and since the, if you like, the birth of the modern animal rights movement, it's always been about reaching that point. We just have to reach that point where it becomes unstoppable. So I will never accept they're too powerful, will have too much money. They still succumb to an idea whose time is right, and it's up to us to make sure that that idea's time is right, and we do that by doing what we do best: grassroots activism, being smart, being clever, being brave when we have to be, and being quick on our heels when we have to be.
Nice.
I think that is, I think that is the perfect place to end it. Inspirational as ever. I have always been a great admirer of your honesty and your tenacity and your ability to be quite succinct and to put things into a clear and easy to understand format for everybody. And I know you get despondent from time to time, but you've always got something rousing inside you, which inspires me. If it doesn't inspire anyone else, it inspires me, and hopefully I can inspire others as well. And I know Louise inspires loads. I mean, realistically, it's all about inspiring people, as you've said yourself, and getting more of us to get off our asses and go and do stuff.
Absolutely.
So thank you ever so much for your time, Mel. It's been absolutely brilliant, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you everybody for coming. This is recorded. It will be available once again, and we'll see you all at the next thing, whatever that may be. Cheers, Mel. Have a wonderful evening.